يا ربي لك الحمد يا ربي لك الحمد.
Is this your usual time and every night is it, Dr.
Yeah, this is gonna be every single night. This is gonna be every single night, inshallah. Except, well, Sunday and Monday. There's another day, was it Friday, that we're gonna be doing fiqh as-sunnah. Well, no, not fiqh as-sunnah, but basically fiqh al-ibadat. So you could always join us. Yeah, every single day we've got something, alhamdulillah.
At the same time?
Pretty much, yes, at the same time. Every single day we've got something.
Except Friday?
Well, Friday, that would be the fiqh.
No,
Okay.
no tafsir.
No tafsir on that day.
Only one day. No
That
tafsir.
would be your Saturday. No, wait a minute. That would be your Friday?
Yeah, our Friday.
I'll let Noura tell me again and refresh my memory. I forgot. Okay. So let us start right here. And yesterday we were basically doing the general tafsir. So we did Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal ard wa ja'ala adh-dhulumati wan nur. We talked about the meaning of Alhamdulillah, and we used two terminologies. We said there's that alif lam. So I'm just kind of recapping and refreshing our memory of what we did yesterday. So just a reminder, in Lugha Arabiya, you've got two types of words. Some words are to be conjugated, called mushtaq, and some words are not conjugated. In other words, they don't actually go back to a root. Okay, they don't go back to a root. Now, in Lugha Arabiya, the words that go to their origin being a root, that root would be basically a verb. And when we're speaking about a verb, we're talking about either a three-lettered verb, which acts as pretty much 75% of the words are three-lettered root, or a 4 or 5, and 6 is probably just 2 words or 3 words, but most of them are actually three-lettered root. Okay. And at the same time, when we're speaking about those conjugated words, the ones that are not jamid, basically, meaning that they are conjugated, but there are some words that are jamid, meaning that they don't go back to a root. This is really what they are. So you've got a lot of nouns, and that's why they would have sometimes differences of opinions. Does this actually go back to a root? Just like the word Allah, is that a root going back to a root that is a conjugated root, or is that basically jamid, meaning that no, this is as is. It's basically not a conjugated word, and therefore does not go back to a root. Well, why is that even important to talk about, whether it's conjugated or not conjugated, etc.? Because if you're saying that a word is conjugated from a certain word, from a certain root, that's extremely important, because the word that it is conjugated from is going to trace back and going to basically have that meaning basically affecting the general meaning. So when we're looking at alhamdu, ha ma da would be the root, and alhamdu, even though yes, the root is hamada, which is a verb, definitely a past tense verb. Okay, that would be the verb, but alhamdu would not actually be a verb, but it would actually be right there, alhamdu, that it's talking about the praise itself. So basically making it a noun in that situation. Speaking of which, when you're adding an L to it, there are two types of L's. In other words, two types of a defining article, al. It's either going to be an inclusive al, to meaning that it includes multiple interpretations that involve the actual word. So if we're talking about alhamdu, are we talking about a specific praise, which is going to be a specific praise for a specific thing, for a specific, that basically is involving the context? Or are we talking about something rather inclusive to mean different types of praises, different forms, different reasons, different shapes of how we can actually interpret that in? So that's that area that involves that alhamdu and that identifying article. Now, when we speak about alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal ard, I did actually forget yesterday to mention that when you see the prelude, alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal ard, all the praise belongs to the one that created the heavens and the earth. So why would we necessarily say all the praise? Why would a surah even start with considering that that is something to celebrate? Why is this even something that we should regard as something to celebrate, something to see as a good thing? Well, that's redirecting our focus, because many times you would see certain people thinking that life in itself is nothing but coming with pain. Okay, that it's coming only with pain, and with this pain, therefore, it is nothing but evil. Now, when you look at Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal ard, it is to reprogram the Muslim mind to let them recognize that this is not pain, but this is actually a gain. This is a privilege, that the creation of the heavens and the earth, that the creation of what you see around you is actually a privilege. And with this privilege, you have to take in the note. Sorry about that. Sorry about that, but okay. So with that privilege, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically letting us know that this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us, and therefore we should take that as one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be praised for. And that's redirecting our vision, because many times people would only see the world as a negative thing, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's praise, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hikmah and his wisdom basically surpasses all that we might actually create certain narratives to distort the real image of why this life was created for. Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal ard وجعل الظلمات والنور. We also talked about the difference between khalaqa and ja'ala, and we talked about al-dhulumat and al-nur, and the differences between al-dhulumat being basically a plural and al-nur being a singular. ثم الذين كفروا بربهم يعدلون. We also talked about يعدلون and what that entails. هو الذي خلقكم من طين ثم قضى أجلا. And we talked about how the ayah was letting us, of course, redirect our focus from looking at the magnificence in the creation of the heavens and the earth to looking at something that is rather smaller, which is our own creation, and what that really entails in terms of one, the privilege that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created us and given us the different privileges to take the test and basically get to Jannah. وَهُوَ اللَّهُ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَفِي الْأَرْضِ يَعْلَمُ سِرَّكُمْ وَجَهْرَكُمْ. But we promised that we're going to go to Surah Al-An'am in Tafseer Al-Qurtubi. So let's just look at it for a bit. Tafseer Al-An'am in Surah Al-Qurtubi, Tafseer Surah Al-An'am in Tafseer Al-Qurtubi is actually in the 8th juz. So let's just look at it real quick. So let's see how it happens. Okay, so when we look at, let's see, just remember page 310. I want to show you the tafsir that we're using. This is the tafsir that we're using. Al-Jami' li Ahkam al-Quran, and for Al-Qurtubi. You could see Ta means the year that he had died in, 671 Hijriya. And we're using the tahqiq, even though he didn't necessarily personally do it, but he basically had a group or a team basically working with him. We're using the 8th juz', and the publishing company is this company. So let's go to that page number 310 that we were using. Okay, so let's see. Al-Qurtubi said, and it is Meccan surah, meaning that it was revealed after Hijrah, according to the majority of the scholars. I want you to look at this one. When he says, based on the majority of the scholars, it is to note that some scholars, and this is the inference, that some scholars regarded it as not necessarily entirely Mecca, to meaning before Hijrah, the time of its revelation or the place of its revelation, but some scholars are actually regarded that a numerous number of ayat are basically Madani, meaning that it was revealed, or at least a number of different ayat were revealed after Hijrah. But there's a question that, Sister Umayya, you were asking a question in regards to the referencing, and when did these books of tafsir actually get collected and written? What was your question again? Can you tell me the question again? You want to tell me your question?
Yeah, my question was about tafsir. They work on its Sahaba during the time of the Prophet ﷺ or afterhand. Then one Sahabi, he has two meaning for one ayah or one word, like Ibn Abbas.
Okay, so those are actually two questions. Let me break it down. So when the Prophet ﷺ was around the Sahaba, living around the Sahaba and with the Sahaba, he was basically the one to give them the tafsir for the ayat. So لا يلدكم من أعمالكم شيئا, they would say, well, what does that mean? And he would explain it to them. Okay, so that was when the Prophet ﷺ was around. So that was pretty straightforward. But when the Prophet ﷺ was around, even the Sahaba, they did vary in their understanding of the ayat. Let's give an example. When Surah Al-Nasr was revealed, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq understood that this surah and the revelation of that surah is bringing a note of the finalization, in that the Prophet ﷺ's mission was finalized, and therefore sending condolences and marking and announcing the end of the Prophet ﷺ's era or mission. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq understood, let's say, what that ayah was entailing. That's a kind of tafsir, basically. That's a kind of interpretation. Okay. But the other Sahaba did not understand that. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq did. At the same time, you would see sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would say, well, what is this really meaning? Just like, for example, in regards to that ayah, which tree is that in that Sahabi? Well, I felt and I wanted to say that it was the palm tree, but I was shy to say that in front of everyone because I was the youngest, etc. Now, you would see that the Sahaba had different capacities. And now, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, you had different Sahaba take the lead in bringing about the tafsir. That is such as 1, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, 2, Abdullah ibn Abbas, 3, Abdullah ibn Umar, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Those were considered the leading figures that gave detailed tafsir. But they weren't doing the tafsir like we are doing it right now, where they would be holding classes, etc., because they generally understood what the words are saying. But sometimes there may be certain inferences, certain ambiguities, and certain contexts that some Sahaba had more information on that other Sahaba did not have. Okay, so you would have, for example, some dispute. Well, when was this ayah revealed? And they would say, well, I remember the place. I remember when it was revealed. I remember what really happened. I remember who it was referring to, who it was relating to, and what was the context during that time. So you'll have certain Sahaba, they would basically have more information. So when you say, I know where it was revealed, I know when it was revealed, I know the context, I know who it was referring to, well, that's a form of tafsir. What is tafsir? Tafsir basically means to bring in clarity on certain meanings, on certain ayat, whether we're speaking about the context, or whether we're speaking about the words, or whether we're speaking about the grammar of it, or whether we're speaking about the context and certainly all those details. So that's why you would see the books of tafsir containing all this information. Now, so the Sahaba themselves, when they gave certain tafsir, that wasn't necessarily all documented. Okay, so it wasn't until later, of course, you had certain Sahaba that taught the tafsir mainly to the Mawali. Who are those? Mawali are usually the slaves that lived with that, for example, Sahabi. They were slaves, they were later freed slaves, and those slaves basically had direct relationship with that Sahabi, for example, while they lived in their home. They basically had spent a lot of time learning from them, and certainly later on, they were the ones to not be in positions of probably leadership in politics or probably in business, etc., but they were taking the lead in transmitting the information that they had learned from the Sahaba, and the Sahaba learned it from the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so when you look at, for example, Mujahid, you look at the Qatada, you look at different Mufassirin, they actually trace back to a Sahabi. Maybe Abdullah ibn Abbas, maybe Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, maybe Abdullah ibn Umar, al-Abadila basically, or maybe Umar ibn al-Khattab, etc. And they'll trace, or maybe Sayyidah Aisha even. Okay, they'll trace back to a certain Sahabi. Okay, so you got a lot of Mawali. Look at that word, Mawali. Just remember that. Those were basically the ex-slaves. Later, of course, documentation was necessary. that documentation for the tafsir to make sure that the tafsir is not exclusive to just understanding the language itself, but we needed to maintain and preserve the references that relate to one, the context, the tafsir that was tracing back to a Sahabi, to the Prophet ﷺ, etc. So you had one of the earliest tafsir was basically Tafsir al-Tabari. Tafsir al-Tabari is one of the most important tafsir because Tafsir al-Tabari basically works in the form in a way where it would say, well, this is what Ibn Abbas had said, and here's our chain of narration to prove that Ibn Abbas said this. But here's one thing. Because there was no early documentation. So when you're talking about Tafsir al-Tabari, you're talking about someone that died 210 Hijriya. So we're talking about almost 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so that was the earliest, one of the earliest documentations for the books of tafsir. Okay, but later on, you had other scholars of tafsir that wanted to embed the different sciences to expand our knowledge because we had one, what is called ujmat al-lisan. What is that? Because we had a political expansion within the Muslim society, we had more and more people that were converting to Islam that were not Arab, and certainly that was bringing in more and more let's say confusion in understanding the words. Less and less people were dedicated to learning the Quran, learning the Hadith, and learning the details of Islam that required more details for tafsir. More details actually meaning that it was requiring further study, further documentation, and having the books of tafsir. The bigger the tafsir, we're talking about that, the bigger the tafsir, you would see more of those bigger tafsir later in history than early in history. Why? Because you would see the farther you are away from the beginning and the birth of Islam, the more distant and the less people knew about the Quran and about the tafsir. So it required embedding further and elaborating more on the words because people became more and more ignorant in understanding the words. In understanding the words, in understanding the context, in understanding the Arabic language, etc. So it needed further elaboration. So you would say the bigger the tafsir usually gives you further elaboration, more and more clarity, because you would see in history, people grew in their ignorance, let's say it that way. They basically, one, their Arabic was going into further regression. Their understanding of maqasid al-sharia, basically the legal maxims of Islam, also grew. And number three, their relationship with the Quran further grew. So that brought in this type of tafsir that basically embedded different sciences to bring about further elaboration. So when we say tafsir, we're talking about elaboration, we're talking about bringing clarity, we're talking about expanding our vision in how we understand the words of the Quran. Now, but later, because of the vast information that was basically embedded and coming in and being brought into the elaboration / tafsir of al-Quran, that required further classification. What type of classification? Then that required further classification because the bigger the amount, the more you want to bring this type of classification to downsize it, to make it at least in, kind of like compartments and departments. Because when something is in a big amount, it becomes really hard to understand. So they needed to put it in some sort of a classification. So you had some books of tafsir that were focused on the Arabic side of it. So you're talking about, for example, Tafsir al-Kashaf. It's not that big, it's in 6 volumes, but it is extremely advanced in the Arabic language in maybe I could actually show that to you and probably, let's put it out there, right? In speaking about the side and Lugha Arabiya and what that means and how do we understand the words and what they're relating to. This is Tafsir al-Kashaf right there. Okay. And you had other books of tafsir, like al-Qurtubi was more dedicated on Ahkam al-Quran, basically the Islamic legislature, the fiqh side, the jurisprudence side, and what does that look like? And how do we focus on that? Well, you had Ibn al-Arabi as well, Tafsir Ibn al-Arabi. He was also dedicating his tafsir to pretty much just focusing on that side, which really just is legislature. In fact, in Tafsir al-Quran al-Karim, basically for Ibn al-Arabi, that tafsir would not actually go in all the ayat. No, it will just discuss pretty much almost 300 ayat, 350, give or take, okay, the ayat that are relating to Islamic rulings. So he won't talk about عما يتساءلون عن النبي العظيم, all of that relates to Aqidah. That's not what his book is dedicated into. You had other books of tafsir that wanted to use all. The side that relates to Lugha Arabiya, the other side that relates to Ahkam Sharia or legislature, etc., and we're more focused on tazkiyah. So you had the tazkiyah piece of it, and they were just focused on how can we read and understand that tazkiyah within these ayat, and how can we see that spirituality within those ayat. You had other scholars that did something rather different, which is called the Tafsir al-Mawdu'i. Tafsir al-Mawdu'i more goes into certain subjects and focuses on these subjects and would have a different reading for that tafsir. One dangerous tafsir that is rising right now and gaining popularity, I would say, unfortunately, and that is claiming that there is a different way in interpreting the Quran outside of the Arabic language. Wait a minute, why did you just call that dangerous? I called it dangerous because the more fluid you are in putting in an interpretation to what we know was a text that is al-Wahy, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyya. It was really clear, straightforward, that it was in Lugha Arabiya, and therefore, if you are to be fluid in your interpretation, in your narrative, in the way that you wanted to put in your own inspiration, and not necessarily what the inspiration is actually saying / al-Wahy is saying, then you're making up your own Quran. You're not reading the Quran. You're making up your own interpretation. You're making up your own words. You're making up your own reading. And that is basically going to be nothing but a deviant interpretation. And it's unfortunately gaining popularity. It's extremely dangerous because if you're making up your own interpretation to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And basically, this is actually coming from something that we're living in today. It's called postmodernism. What is postmodernism? So postmodernism regards that there is no truth, but one truth, that there's no truth. That's one thing. Two, there is no specific words and meanings to words. You can just derive and make up your own interpretation. And that's why they would basically consider that there's nothing factual, everything is an absurdity, and therefore you can just make up your own truth, you can make up your own interpretation. And unfortunately, this is very common in the West, because in the West right now, of course, with the whole idea that there is no truth but one truth, and it's just your truth, and it comes from the whole idea of what they would consider as the death of the author. The death of the author, and therefore it's not what the words are saying, but it's how you feel about it. So we would see sisters gathering together, and each one is trying to say what's inspiring her about the ayat, what's inspiring her about this hadith, and what does she read from these words, and how does she understand it, and etc. And then they would say this is basically a tafsir. And that comes with this idea that we're actually calling dangerous. Because if we're saying that, yes, we're going to make our own tafsir, and rather than going through the Lugha Arabiya, rather than going through the hadith, or going through what traces back to the Prophet ﷺ and how he interpreted those ayat, and how the Sahaba also learned the interpretation from the Prophet ﷺ and passed it on and transmitted it to us. And because it's definitely requiring qualification to be able to go back to the books of tafsir, you're seeing the same postmodern type of inspiration and postmodern way of interpreting religion is right now something that a lot of Muslims are adopting. A lot of Muslims, and you see that often in masajid, and they'll say, well, we have a halaqah, we've got activism going on, and this is what we're doing. And each one is basically sharing her own inspiration and what she reads from it, and etc. It doesn't have to be just women, but we're seeing that often. Because in the West right now, religion is not to be taught by text or by a scholar, but religion is considered as it's your feeling, it's your experience, it's how you read it. So instead of making it as an inspiration of wahi, coming from a source of wahi, that it's all about the individual, and they're becoming the source of that inspiration. So they're shifting the inspiration from al-wahi to your own feeling, to the individual having that inspiration, and therefore thinking that, and in this basically is what brings in universalism. Universalism is right now becoming, I would say, the what should I call it? The tool? No, it's not the tool, but I would say the merchandise that Muslims are importing from the Western culture and bring it inside. And they're learning it at the university, etc., and at the schools, and then they would come in and want to apply the same system that they would find on college campuses. And that is considering that religion is to be shifted from considering the text as a reference, from considering the wahi as the reference, to considering the individual as the reference. And that's the idea of universalism, because it regarded that there is the death of God. Subhanallah. There is the death of God, which basically is what Friedrich Nietzsche had called for. He said, well, it's the end of God, it's the end of religion, and therefore it's basically the homocentricity. It's basically we make religion, we make truth, we invent truth. It's about what we regard as truth. And unfortunately, you could see that indoctrinating this kind of lifestyle, this kind of philosophy, this kind of way of reading the text is definitely influencing and infiltrating the Muslim mind. And we're seeing a lot of Muslims right now coming in that, wait a minute, why do I have to ask a sheikh? Why can't I make my own interpretation? So you would see on social media, girls or men even coming in, especially women, I would say, coming in right now with this feminist interpretation, coming in and saying, well, hey, the interpretation was very misogynist and was patriarchal. Therefore, we can come in and make a new female interpretation, a new way of interpreting text, and we don't have to listen to what they were saying because they were influenced by their own community, by their own male dominance and so forth. And then, of course, we would see this becoming common. And of course, they would be called influencers. They would get the platforms on social media, and it becomes common that people are losing the trace of how we go back to the books of tafsir that did the job for us. The scholars of tafsir, they simply did the job for us in one, bringing in the early documentation of what the Prophet ﷺ in hadith had interpreted the Quran in, to what the scholars of hadith had also basically preserved in documentation to let us know the resource and let us know how the Prophet ﷺ interpreted this ayah or interpreted such ayah, what the contexts were, what really had happened, etc., what the Sahaba, basically what is called al-Athar, what the Sahaba had interpreted this ayah. And it's not, oh, they're men and we're men, hey, or we're also women, hey, what's the difference? We could do our own interpretation and we don't have to worry about that, and we could just do the same thing. No, absolutely not, because they were depending not on their own inspiration, but they were depending on the what traces back and the transmissions that they had received through the Prophet ﷺ, through the Lugha Arabiya, through the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, through maqasid al-sharia, through the legal maxims. And it wasn't a personal note. It wasn't a personal type of an inspiration. Now, this is extremely important to keep in mind. So the scholars of tafsir, they basically gathered these resources and they would make it available to us. But is everybody capable of going back to these resources? Well, in order to be capable of going to these resources, Lugha Arabiya is key. Arabic language is a very important key. Even if you are to get, I don't know, an AI translation, the AI translation would give you a piece, a side of that ilm, but it would not give you everything. So it's extremely important
Can
to
you
go.
just make dua for us that we become fluent?
Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, ya Rabbi. And it takes a lot of dedication, it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of patience, Noura. There's no ilm that comes with no patience. There's
Okay.
no ilm that comes with no patience. And
Jazakallah khair.
this is important to just keep in mind. And it takes a lot of humility. We have to be humble. You know, in a society that is right now embedding universalism, what is universalism? Universalism basically regards that God is dead and it's you and all religions are pretty much the same, but each one has a piece of God within them. And this piece of God within them basically is just their view of God, but all religions, they just have different practices and different ways of embedding the understanding of God, embedding
That's
the
crazy
practice
because
of this is
there's just one truth, Yani.
there you go. But believe it or not, this is actually becoming a trend, Noura. Why am I bringing this up? Because this is becoming a trend, and we're seeing a lot of people adopt this lifestyle and think that, well, all religions are right. We're all children of God, and therefore we're all basically supposed to just consider that we just have different ways of practicing religion. The Buddhists will practice connecting with God differently, or connecting, well, the Buddhists not, but the Hindus at least, because Buddhists are atheists. But the Christians will have their way, but that we're actually all turning to one God. And that's right there, the main threshold, and that's kufr on the spot. Because when we're talking about Tawheed, we're not just talking about the difference in understanding who is God, but we're also talking about ibadah. We're talking about details and, well, what is God? Who is God? How do we turn to God? What is God requiring us of doing, and what information and where do we get to finding this information about God? So if we're seeing many Muslims getting infiltrated and basically their mind indoctrinated by, of course, this new, I would say, religious atheist movement. I know you would be like, what is religion and religious atheist? Isn't that an oxymoron? So atheism is actually in two ways. Yes, one denies God, and the other one denies God, but has a different religious practice. So in practice, they're basically denying the existence of God, but they'll say, well, we've got our own spiritual way of relating to, whether it's life, nature, the world around us, our spirit, or whatever they would call it. You know, they would, each time they would give it a different name, and it depends on the group and etc. So they'll basically give you those words and those interpretations, those rhetorics, those narratives, each one giving you their own way of how they would reach out. And at the end, it's الظلمات. الظلمات are basically different kinds. All right, so when we look at the second question that you asked, how come we might have tafsir, for example, for Ibn Abbas, but we would have Ibn Abbas says this, and then another note would say something else. One, sometimes he can give different interpretations depending on the context. Two, there can be multiple interpretations that were noted upon that Sahabi. Okay, just keep that one in mind. Okay, قال ابن عباس وقتادة وهي مكية كلها إلا آيتين. So remember when he said, or at least al-Qurtubi said, that it was a Meccan surah. So why is that important? Because it's talking about the context. We're talking about the historical context. We're talking about the information that in place, in time, in chronology that surrounded the revelation of this surah. Okay, so this is why this information is important. We're talking about, okay, what is the place? What is the historical context that basically surrounded the revelation of these words? How do we put it within the context of place and time when this ayah was revealed? That's the whole thing that they are discussing. So some scholars like Ibn Abbas said, well, the whole thing is actually Meccan, revealed before Hijrah and in Mecca, except two ayat. They were revealed in Medina, which is this ayah, ayah 91, Okay, and the other one, وهو الذي أنشأ جنات معروشات, which is ayah 141. Okay, so that was according to Ibn Abbas and Qatada. They said, well, two ayat were not actually Meccan, but they were revealed in Medina. Do all scholars actually agree with that? Well, not all scholars would agree with that. So just to note, with certain intricate details, you can have a certain dispute. Does it really matter that big? It usually matters. Just keep that one in mind. It usually matters in relationship to, of course, legislation. Why? Because it's important to know when this ayah, if the ayah was related to legislation, it would be extremely important to know the history, or at least when this ayah was revealed, if we wanted to talk about the chronology, or at least and say that this ayah was abrogated, or this ayah abrogated another ruling. What does abrogate mean? Basically canceled out the application of a certain ruling with a new ruling. In order to say one canceled out another, that means you need to prove that one came first and the other came after. So that is when we would need evidence and strong evidence to prove the dating, or at least which one came first and which one came after. Okay, all right, let's see. ذكر ابن العربي. Why are we talking about Ibn al-Arabi? So Ibn al-Arabi is Maliki, and let's say, and he says, well, قل لا أجد, ayah 145, he said it was actually revealed in Mecca on the day of Arafah. So what does that mean? On the day of Arafah, we're talking about 10-year hijrah, or are we talking about 8-year hijrah? Okay, so let's say, how was the surah revealed? So you had, according to, when you say fil khabar, we're talking about evidences, we're talking about ahadith that would say and prove that the Quran was, or at least Surah Al-An'am, sorry, that Surah Al-An'am was revealed as one whole. So it wasn't revealed in just small partitions of verses, but it was actually revealed entirely the whole surah, except 6 ayat, and that it was embraced and it was like rallied by 70,000 angels. Except one ayah, there were 12,000 angels, and that one, just that ayah alone, وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو. What does that mean? And he has the keys to the unseen. Unseen can mean unseen in history, can mean unseen whatever that is probably in the future. We're talking about history, we're talking about future, we're talking about place as well. So all that would basically be the al-ghaib. Or al-ghaib, does that mean al-ghaib al-jannah, nar, hellfire, heaven? What is really al-ghaib? Are we talking about place? Are we talking about time? Are we talking about information about the things that are unseen? Jinn, angels, what are we talking about al-ghaib? So mafatihul ghaib, we're not talking about keys, literal keys. We're talking about metaphorical keys, the information, basically, in regards to all these things that as a human being, you are not capable of unlocking, or you're not capable of having more information, because it is basically it is not within your capacity to unlock this information. It's only in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing the past and the future. Are we ever going to invent some kind of a machine, or some kind of a, I don't know, like a time machine, and go back in history? Is that ever going to happen? Absolutely not. Why? Because وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how to unlock this way of going in history, whether in the future or in the past, or whether we're speaking about unlocking places or unlocking maybe, hey, I'm sitting down right here. Do we have jinn around me? Am I going to be able to see jinn? Am I going to be able to see the malaika? That's ghaib. Okay. So that ayah, according to this note, that there were 12,000. So wait a minute. So when you say shayya'aha, what is it tashyi'? Tashyi' can be, it's a group of people or a group of, in this context, it's a group of angels basically coming in to recognize the importance of this note. So they're basically standing in honor of that surah or that ayah. So in honor of Surah Al-An'am, 70,000 angels were standing, and in honor of that particular ayah, 12,000 angels were standing. Let's see. نزلوا بها ليلا لهم زجل بالتسبيح والتحميد. Let's look at this one. What is نزلوا بها ليلا? That night, okay, that night when that ayah was revealed, they basically had come in لهم زجل بالتسبيح. What is a zajal? A zajal is a hem. There is a sound of a harmony, and there is a certain, it's kind of like a song. It's kind of like a song, a certain sound. They were doing a tasbih. Were they doing it together? Were they doing it as individuals? Allahu A'lam. But it was a sound that it was together, a tasbih sound that had a certain harmony to it. That's a zajal. A certain sound. They were doing tasbih, they were doing tahmeed. So certainly they were standing in rally in honor of those ayat, and there was a sound of tasbih and tahmeed. They were doing it together to honor this, this revelation of that surah. So the Prophet ﷺ, then when that ayah was revealed, دعا الكتاب فكتبوها من ليلتهم. The Prophet ﷺ دعا الكتاب. Basically, he had a team. Okay, that team, they were responsible for scribing the Quran. They were called, let's write their name down. Okay, they were called كتبة الوحي. Let's write it down. كتبة الوحي. They were the ones to scribe and be the ones to scribe the Quran. So the Quran was actually preserved in two ways. Number one is في الصدور and في السطور. الصدور, basically in chest. They would memorize it. And you had another team, and amongst them, for example, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ka'b ibn Ubay, or Ubay ibn Ka'b, sorry, and you had Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. You had a number. They were katabat al-wahy. They were the ones to write it down. And on that day, they were all there just basically with one homework, which is to scribe what the wahy was saying. And the Prophet ﷺ would oversee and supervise as they would write it. And the Prophet ﷺ would say, well, make the meme clear, make the ba clear, etc., and would tell them to write it down. Okay, so this is basically that note. I want to look at here. He said, لم نقف عليه بهذا اللفظ. So in this particular way of noting, in other words, with this way of articulating it, we don't actually have that note in that way, but it was actually mentioned by Abu Ubaid in Fada'il al-Quran, Ibn al-Durais in Fada'il al-Quran. So you had a number of different scholars that actually noted noted this piece of information. But you could see we don't necessarily have the details of how authentic it is, because usually these notes would be mentioned, but not necessarily in a chain of narration. It would be mentioned, it would be transmitted, passed on, and this information would basically be mentioned as the way that it was noted, and not necessarily as a quote of based on the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, but it would definitely be in the category, or what would be called marfu'. What is marfu'? Marfu' actually means it would trace back to the Prophet ﷺ, and the opposite of marfu' would be mawquf, which would be tracing back to the Sahabi. So when we look at this information, well, the Sahaba themselves, there's no way that they would know that there were 70,000 angels rallying in honor for this ayah. There's no way that they could know it, because this is considered ghaib. This is considered as part of the unseen. The only way that the Sahaba would be capable of noting that, the only way that the Sahaba would be capable of noting that and knowing that that is true is basically by going back to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, let's continue right there. I wanted to look at this note. Anas ibn Malik, he said, the Prophet ﷺ had said, نزلت Surah Al'anam, okay, that Surah Al-An'am was revealed with موكب من الملائكة, with a group. Al-Mawkib is like a large group of malaika to basically honor these ayat. And that these groups were basically covering al-Khafiqain. What is al-Khafiqain? Al-Khafiqain is kind of like saying Maghribain. Al-Khafaqa shay, meaning that it basically went away. So we're talking about al-Khafiqain to mean the east and west. That the angels were filling the east and west, and they basically had this beautiful sound of tasbih that they were doing, a form of tasbih, a form of dhikr, basically, and that the earth was trembling from their words. And the Prophet ﷺ would say, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim 3 times. But I want you to look at this one. Okay, you could see that it was mentioned, Tabarani al-Awsat, al-Bayhaqi. It's quite actually beautiful too, and you could see Ma'ani al-Quran right there. So, you've got those references that basically had said the same thing, or at least the same, coming in with the same idea, that the malaika were making a sound of tasbih. They would be together, subhanallah, 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 and the sound had zajal. It would have a harmony. I don't know, it gives me the goosebumps to think of it as there was a harmony of tasbih. There was a harmony of dhikr. Can we actually make a harmony too? We're together and making a harmony of dhikr. Is that bid'ah? Okay, let me break that down. So number one is that you have the scholars, basically Ahl al-Hadith. Okay, Ahl al-Hadith, they are very, let's say, dedicated. Let's use that word. They're very dedicated to being committed to the Prophet ﷺ and how he taught that spirituality or learning the deen, or commitment in the deen, or ritual is to be practiced. So they're very dedicated and committed to the text. On the other hand, you had other scholars. They're basically called, well, I would say Sufi, okay? The mystical groups. And the mystical groups, they would vary. So you would have different tariqas. What does that mean? So the different tariqa, a tariqa means path. In these paths, there would be the sheikh, there would be the scholar, basically the teacher, or the teacher, the person to teach the students. Okay. And the sheikh would put in his experience, and it's mainly anecdotal, on how to let the murid / the student find their way to connect with the Quran or Islam or the Sunnah, or basically to connect with maqasid al-Sharia. So they'll embed their experiences in basically directing al-murid, which basically is the student, to helping them stay connected with Islam. Okay, so that would be the Sufi tariqah. The Sufi tariqah is, I would say, fluid sometimes, can be really fluid. So you would have one tariqah, basically the teacher would say, well, what we can embed is mainly the students, when they're coming in with their dhikr, they're usually losing their focus, they're not committed. So what if we would do it in a group? So we're doing it in a group, and in this group, we'll make a group of tasbih together, a group of dhikr, a group of Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Maybe we'll make it 1,000 times, maybe 200 times, etc. And therefore, you'll have one tariqah. You'll have another tariqah that will say, well, hey, it's not enough to let the murids stick to just the words and just say repeat a certain set of dhikr or a certain set of remembrance, but we need to embed something else in it, and perhaps a movement. What type of movement? Maybe go in a circle. Maybe another movement. Where did you get the circle from? Well, we got it from the rotation of Earth, the rotation of things in space, maybe, or even the rotation around the Kaaba. We'll make it into a circle, get them into moving with that. And saying what? Well, things like Yahu, or maybe things Ya Allah, or maybe Allah Hay, and of course, each tariqah is going to embed a different way. You'll get another scholar that would say, well, no, let's actually put in, I don't want to say scholar, but I'll say another tariqah, like the Mawlawi tariqah, and they'll actually go farther. The Mawlawi tariqah, and they'll say, well, no, what we could do, we'll get the inspiration from what we would see, the different things in the universe going into rotation. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go into like the Darvish in Turkey, and they'll basically, wear these skirts and have this long hat and go in this Mawlawi tariqah and basically go in circle and circle and circle and circle and go into these circles, believing that what this is going to do is that it's going to let the soul or the spirit of God, while they're going into these circles, man, I just got dizzy just thinking of them. Literally, Wallahi al-Azim, I got dizzy just imagining those circles. Okay, going into these circles, that it's basically going to give them this inspiration, connect with the inspiration, and basically just learn how to stay focused on one particular thing and so forth, and you'll get. Now, one thing to mention is that a lot of these tariqas, okay, a lot of these tariqas did get their inspiration from not only their experience, but their experience was also influenced by, perhaps you would say, the tariqas in Africa, the Tijani tariqa. You could definitely see a lot of influence from the voodoo. You could see a lot of influence from the pagan religions in Africa. If you were to go to India, you could definitely see a lot of influence from the Hindu culture. If you were to go farther in other Southeast Asian countries, you would also see the influence of Buddhism. You were to go to Uzbekistan and those, you would definitely see the influence of Buddhism. You would see the influence of Persian religions, Zoroastrian religions, etc., and that would have its influence without us realizing. So definitely, we could see, when we're talking about Zajalun bit tasbih, can we get the same inspiration? I would say it's a very slippery slope if we keep it using, well, let's get the inspiration from this religion, that religion. I remember I was giving a lecture at the University of Minnesota once, and I had a group of Muslim students. And these Muslim students were coming to me, and they were telling me that they were studying Hinduism. And the reason why they were studying Hinduism is because it was their doorway to understand Tawheed. Wallahi, this is real. I'm not making this up. This is real. You're studying shirk to understand Tawheed. You're studying Hinduism to understand Tawheed. But this is what's happening to a lot of Muslim students on college campuses. They're completely lost in learning their Islam. Completely lost in learning their Islam. And unfortunately, we're seeing many want to study Islam by learning, for example, through maybe a theologian, or perhaps maybe a Jewish professor, or a Hindu professor, etc. And they're saying, well, we're learning Islam. But there's no way. You got to go back to the Prophet ﷺ. You got to go back to Quran. You got to go back to the Sunnah. You got to go back to the Sahaba. You got to go back to the scholars and how they preserved such information for us, and not make your own interpretation. So when we're talking about going back to the Sufi tariqah and going back to that Zajr bit-tasbih many would ask about, I would say the Ahl al-Hadith path is certainly Aslam. What is Aslam? Aslam, it's safer. Because the more you innovate, the more you add on to what you might interpret as, well, with my experience, it would let the students focus better. It would get them to connecting. It would get them engaged, etc. And then we're adding more and more things. Then what you may not realize is that you had just invented a religion. You had just invented a way that the Prophet ﷺ did not teach. And then you created a completely different system, whether we're speaking about a ritual, a system of rituals, a system of prayers, a system of dhikr, everything that is completely different than what the Prophet ﷺ had taught. So the path of sticking to learning ritual by learning what the Prophet ﷺ had taught, what the Prophet ﷺ had basically instructed that we would practice, and we would learn, and we would take the time to grow in our connection and commitment, is basically the safest way. Although the other tariqas, I'll tell you, it sounds very inspirational at times. You would definitely see that there is some attraction to perhaps maybe this tariqah or that tariqah, and especially when you would see the fluidity of it. It's all about being fluid in in your practices. It's not really serious about implementing the legislation of Islam, in implementing that. No, it's about, well, hey, you could just be a person that is Muslim, but as long as you're within our group, you're doing this type of dhikr, you're doing this type of spiritual connection, and that's all that matters. And you would see replacing, and this is what's dangerous about those tariqas. What's dangerous about those tariqas is the replacement of ilm with these tariqas, with these ways, different ways. So instead of investing in learning the what the Prophet ﷺ had taught in terms of probably what the words are saying, what the ayat are saying, what the wahi is saying, how we are supposed to understand our Islam, instead of investing in that, it's taking the time to engage in actions, just trying to say, well, it's getting me stronger in my connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What really will get you stronger in your connection is, number one, certainly you knowing about it, learning more, and two, creating certainly a certain community where not only are you learning, but you're also putting in that investment. Well, how do I apply it on ground? What about the spirituality? This doesn't contradict it. This doesn't contradict it. To make salah jama'ah, to make the dhikr, to read the Quran, to learn al-qira'at, to learn the dhikr, to learn tafsir, to learn fiqh, all of that is in itself that method. While you're sitting down learning tafsir, you're actually engaging in dhikr. You're expanding your vision. You're expanding your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're taking the time to relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what He was teaching and what He was basically sending in to the Prophet ﷺ and to the Anbiya in wahi. Okay, let's see. So when we talk about lahum zajalun bit-tasbih, can we make, for example, a tasbih? I'm making my own tasbih and probably make it in some maqam. What is maqam? Maqam it's basically a harmony. So you've got the Iraqis, they would have a maqam. Egyptians would usually love a certain maqam. Okay, can I make it based on a certain harmony? You can make your tasbih based on a certain harmony. It's not haram to make a certain harmony. When you look at izzajal, so can I sing, for example, my tasbih? You can. Is there a specific harmony that I have to stick to? You don't have to stick to a specific harmony. Even the idea of the maqamat themselves, it wasn't taught at all by the Prophet ﷺ. They were maqamat, meaning they were different harmonies that were famous. Probably one maqam was Nahawan, famous in the areas, in the Persian areas. Another maqam, Iraq. Another maqam, Hijaz. Another maqam, Rust, etc. All those maqamat, they were famous. In other words, harmonies, they were famous in certain areas. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it was taught by the Prophet ﷺ. They were more music harmonies than, and it was, hey, each country has its own favorite sound of what makes a nice musical note. Okay, what makes a nice pattern. And these patterns, they later basically would not only be in music, but it becomes a pattern that people on their own would start sounding in their head and start sounding probably in poetry, etc. And then others wanted to apply those sounds on Quran. Can we apply it on Quran? That's that area of debate between scholars. What all scholars would agree on is that if you were to apply that maqam, harmony, at the expense of the Quranic recitation and its rulings called tajweed, then that would be haram. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Quran not only preserved in its meanings and interpretation, but also preserved in the sound of it. In the sound of it, in the harmony of it, we're speaking about when you would assimilate certain letters, when you would blend certain letters, when you would stretch certain letters, when you would connect certain letters in a certain way, etc. And that's actually part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had preserved. And that cannot be changed, because alternating that to use different maqams or different harmonies, that would basically take away what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it's going to be at the expense of the rule of tajweed, that would basically be a type of editing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That would be a type of addition. Okay, let's see. Darimi, he basically mentioned Umar ibn al-Khattab had said, Al-An'amu min naja'ib al-Quran. So Al-An'am, this is not talking about Al-An'am, meaning the cattle and the different types of animals, but this is talking about Surah Al-An'am min naja'ib al-Quran. What is naja'ib al-Quran? So you could see right there, he said naja'ib al-Quran, meaning it is one of the best surahs. كعب basically said فاتحة التوراة فاتحة الأنعام وخاتمتها خاتمة هود. Let me pause here for a bit. What is the quote saying? Ka'b. Now, Ka'b was not a Sahabi. Ka'b was a Jew who converted to Islam. Okay. When he had converted to Islam, he contributed a lot of the knowledge that he had basically in the Jewish scriptures and what he had known, and later he would share it with the Muslims. And that was what was called al-Israeliyat. So that's why when it comes to Ka'b, you would see a lot of times he would share his knowledge in regards to the Torah or the Mishnah or probably the Talmud and the Old Testament and all of that. And sometimes he would say, well, here's the comparison. Here's based on his knowledge. He wanted to, invest and participate in what he had learned about Judaism and about Christianity or about Ahl al-Kitab, and basically let us see the pattern. Okay, so he said, Fatihatul Torah, Fatihatul An'am. He said, well, the same way that the Torah would start with its Genesis is the same way that you would see in Surah Al-An'am. So how does Genesis start? Well, Genesis starts certainly it starts to talk about the Lord Almighty basically creating the heavens and the earth and etc. So he said, well, the same way that Al-An'am starts in Genesis, the same way the Torah starts in Genesis, he said he was capable of seeing a pattern, or he was capable of seeing similarities between the two. And he said, خاتمتها هود. خاتمتها meaning خاتمة التوراة. And the conclusion in Surah Al-Tawrah, he said it's very similar to what we would find in Surah Hud. Wahb ibn Munabbih was also a Jew that converted to Islam. So he also said the same thing. I mean, right now, of course, we do have the books basically available to us, and we're capable of reading through it. But of course, they knew Hebrew, and at the time, the Torah was not translated into Arabic. So the Arab, or at least the Muslims, the Muslim Arab, did not have access to the Torah or the Old Testament. So they wouldn't be capable of knowing, well, what does it really mean? Because, Ka'b and Wahb ibn Munabbih being of a Jewish descent. And of course, we know that Jews are really strict in learning the Torah, basically in their yeshiva, and learning the Torah. It's going to be in Hebrew, and there's, of course, very strict education on how you learn it and spending a lot of time in learning it. So Ka'b and Wahb ibn Munabbih definitely had that knowledge, and it many times, sometimes you had some Sahaba, some other tabi'in would come to them to ask some information. Do we necessarily need that information? Well, that's why you had other scholars were very critical, at least, of some of the information that was shared by Ka'b and shared by Wahb ibn Munabbih. They were very critical of it because it traces back to Jewish and Christian scriptures. And you had a lot of the Mufassirin, they were really critical of that information, considering that we should not take that as a resource because we are not sure about the validity of such information. Just because it exists in other scriptures does not make it as an aiding reference. So that's why you had some scholars really skeptical and critical of the information that Ka'b and also Wahb would be sharing. Just wanted to mention that one. Al-Mahdawi, where's Mahdawi from? Al-Mahdawi is from Tunisia. It's basically a scholar. He wrote one of the most important books. It was from a city called Al-Mahdiya in Tunisia. And he was one of those scholars that had specific dedication on the importance of certain surahs and the certain types of tafsir. His tafsir is in almost 6 volumes. All right, he said, the Mufassirin basically means the scholars of tafsir. He said, إن التوراة افتتحت بقوله الحمد لله الذي خلق السماوات والأرض. That the Torah basically in Genesis starts out with the same ayah and then ends, at least Genesis, Alhamdulillah الذي لم يتخذ ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك, similar to this ayah. Now, of course, to make these comparisons between the Quran and the Old Testament and the New Testament, definitely you would, if you were to read the Old Testament and New Testament, especially the Old Testament, you could definitely see the similarities, at least in the idea of worshiping God, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. But there are still many differences. And this is important to mention, and there is actually a book that I can probably share. Unfortunately, it's not translated. It's not translated yet, but inshallah, one day it would be translated. Okay, this is the book. Is the Quran plagiarized from the books, the Christian books and the Muslim books or not? And the book actually takes a number of different claims that Orientalists had claimed that the Quran was plagiarized from the Christian scriptures and the Jewish scriptures, and would basically go back to the traces of the words within 1, the Quran, 2, the meaning, 3, how they interpreted it, and 4, what the words in the Jewish, or at least Torah and Jewish scriptures as well, and the Christian scriptures, and what they are actually saying in the original language, and how is it different. And one particular interesting thing in that book is bring about 60 variants just in Surah Yusuf. Just in Surah Yusuf and the story of Prophet Yusuf, just the story, not necessarily the surah itself, but just the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. How is it different? How is the story in the Old Testament about Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam different from the story that is in the Quran? How is it different in the Torah compared to the Quran? How is the whole idea of Prophet Isa alayhi salam different in the New Testament compared to the Quran? How is the idea of whether Genesis or whether Judgment Day or whether God, understanding of God, all of that, how is it different in the Quran compared to the Torah and compared to the New Testament as well? So this book is in almost, I think it was like 388 pages or 400 pages, somewhere around there, but quite interesting, and has a lot of information that really deserves a lot of studying. Okay, let's see. In terms of فضائل السور, I want you to look at this one. In terms of فضائل السور, what is فضائل السور? Let me write that down. Okay, this is going to be, we're going to be taking then, inshallah, a break. Okay, فضائل السور. What is فضائل السور? فضائل السور, certain ahadith do give, let's say, special preference to certain surahs over others. It doesn't mean that the other surah is not a good surah, but we're speaking about giving a special rank, at least, for certain surahs. But note, most of the ahadith that relate to fada'il al-suwar and relate to giving certain surahs a special kind of a preference over other surahs are actually not authentic. So what does that mean? Are you talking about fabricated? Or are we talking about just daif? We're talking about both. Some would be daif and some would be extremely daif. What is daif? Daif means that it is not authentic. What does not authentic actually mean? So when we study a hadith based on two areas. One, the chain of narration that basically goes all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. Two, we would also look at the quote itself and see how we would compare it with other chains of narrations, other quotes, whether there are discrepancies, whether there are similar quotes that basically supported whatever is in this quote and so forth. Okay, that's one side. But then we would go in details in studying the chain of narration. Who are these people? How did they relate to one another? Did they meet one another? Did they have a history of lying, a history of making up quotes, etc.? Then we would basically scrutinize the chain of narration. And then we would go into the matan itself, to the actual quote, and scrutinize that. So when we're talking about fada'il al-suwar, you had a lot of ahadith that were not necessarily authentic. Okay? And whether the problem with that chain of narration or with that hadith was the chain of narration or whether the actual quote. Well, why are you bringing this up? We're bringing this up because of this hadith. Let's see. من قرأ 3 آيات من أول سورة الأنعام إلى قوله ويعلم ما تكسبون وكل الله به 40,000 ملك يكتبون له مثل عبادتهم إلى يوم القيامة وينزل ملك من السماء السابعة ومعه مرزبة من حديد فإذا أراد الشيطان أن يوسوس له أو يوحي في قلبه شيئا ضربه ضربة فيكون بينه وبينه 70 حجابا فإذا كان يوم القيامة قال الله امش في ظل يوم لا ظل إلا ظلي وكل من ثمار جنتي واشرب من ماء الكوثر واغتسل من ماء السلسبيل فأنت عبدي وأنا ربك. Whoever reads, translates into, whoever reads 3 ayat from the beginning of Surah Al-An'am until وَيَعْلَمُ مَا تَكْسِبُونَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have 40,000 angels basically writing down and scribing يكتبون له مثل عبادتهم إلى يوم القيامة. They would basically write that he was worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way that they would be worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until Judgment Day. And an angel would come from the seventh heaven, and he would basically have something like an axe made of iron. And if Shaitan would attempt to spew his, basically, his delusion or paranoia, or perhaps inspire him in his heart something evil, maybe to do something evil, this angel would strike this shaitan a very strong strike to the point that there would be 70 barriers between the person that read Surah Al-An'am and this shaitan, this devil that is inspiring this person. On Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell him, walk under my shade, for there's no shade but my shade, and eat from the fruits of my garden, and drink from the water of al-Kawthar, which is basically a spring or a pool of water, well, basically more of a lake coming from Jannah. Okay, so like a spring coming from Jannah, and then basically has this area that it lands in. And wash and take a shower from Ma'i Salsabil. Ma'i Salsabil, the pure waters of Jannah. For you are my servant and I am your Lord. Just sounds very beautiful, huh? Sounds very beautiful. But the question is, regardless of how beautiful it sounds, we have to go back and actually see whether this is authentic. See, Al-Wahidi had mentioned this hadith. We've got a beautiful reference right there. So let's see the reference right there. And you got one scholar basically say that this was coming in with a broken chain of narration. It's called mursal. What does mursal mean? That the chain of narration, and there is a clear cut between that tabi'i and how this piece of information traces all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. There's a missing link in that chain of narration. Let's see. Is-Suyuti, when did he die? Anybody know? And you'll get $1,000. Is-Suyuti died 911 Hijriya, not September 11, but 9/11. Okay? Let's see what he says. He says that this is actually a weak narration. It's a poor hadith. And he said, وغالبها في هذا المطلب ضعيف وبعضها موضوع. He said, most of the hadith relating to that are either very weak or fabricated hadith. So what do we understand in this? Just because it sounds very attractive, you're not going to have the scholars of hadith regard a note or a quote as authentic just because it sounds inspiring, or just because it encourages people to read it because, hey, it will get me stronger and that's what I need, and I'll just read Surah Al-An'am and then I'm free of shaitan influence. Well, you could see this hadith is not actually called authentic, even though it sounds inspiring. Why? Because in Islam, we don't use our own feelings as a reference to authenticating or regarding any piece of information as valid information or not. We would have to go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and we would basically go to that information. In that information, and at least scrutinize it based on chain of narration and based on al-matan itself, and not necessarily what we would want of that to say. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna stop right here, and inshallah, tomorrow we'll be continuing the tafsir, but there's a lot to say, so just stay tuned, inshallah. Oh, maybe we could just add this one, right? Okay, we'll just add these two. That way we could at least start this one tomorrow, inshallah. So in البخاري إذا سرك أن تعلم جهل العرب فاقرأ ما فوق 30 و100 من سورة الأنعام. البخاري had said in regards to Ibn Abbas, or at least quoted off Ibn Abbas, if you want to know the ignorance of al-Arab at the time, the pagan Arab during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, then just read the first 130 ayat in Surah Al-An'am, and you would know the ignorance, in other words, the aqidah, the ignorance, the type of lifestyle, and what kind of a culture and an ideology they had practiced at the time before Islam, right? And of course, because this surah is key to debating and certainly refuting the innovations and certainly the wrong ideas that the pagan Arab were living in, whether it's denying that there was any resurrection and of course denying many things that Islam had come with. So this surah is basically, inshallah, letting us break that down. So inshallah, tomorrow, alhamdulillah الذي خلق السماوات والأرض وجعل الظلمات والنور, Al-Qurtubi said there are 5 different issues to discuss in this surah. So stay tuned for tomorrow. We'll do a break right now, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. You can unmute yourselves if you want. Okay, I guess everybody is like, oh, that's all right. Okay. So